Antonio Ruiz here. Welcome to the 1619 podcast. With me is my compatriot, Thomas Fields.
And friend, Thomas Fields.
And friend, Thomas Fields. Today we're dealing with Chapter 11, Inheritance. And I really got to start with this incredible story that the chapter begins about a man named Elmore Bolling. I think that's how I'm pronouncing his name, Bolling. He's described as a one-man economy in a town in Alabama where his family lived. He was a very successful business person. He employed as many as 40 people. And in fact, at some point, his family estimates that he had as much as $40,000 in the bank and more than $5,000 in physical assets, together worth more than $500,000 in today's dollars. And then, make a very long story short, he was killed, probably because, or as they said, somebody said, he may have been a little bit too successful for his own good. He was killed by two white men, and again, making a very long story short, he was, as was reported in the Chicago Defender in 1947, the headline was, "Bolling has long been a marked man," because he was, the whites were jealous over this business success, and he was too successful to be a Negro. Those are their words. And this is not unique and pointed to the legacy of the failed Reconstruction period and the effort by white America to thwart any effort at both political and economic power from one generation to the next. And there's other examples throughout American history, whether it was in 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre in 1921, and just the whole idea that from slavery and Jim Crow, Black Americans were continued to be handed the economic misfortune of their forebears. And they go on to talk about some statistics. And before we get to the statistics, I just wanted to get your reaction, Thomas, to the story that really marks American history, even to this day, but going back to before the Civil War, particularly after the Civil War during Reconstruction.
I'm glad you said up to this day, because I think all too often we believe that somehow or another this ended at the 20th century. One of the most recent examples is Bruce Beach in Manhattan Beach. And for those of you who do not know about Bruce Beach, it was an area in Manhattan Beach, which is today one of the richest areas, certainly one of the richest beach communities, probably just second only to Malibu in Southern California. Bruce Beach was owned by a Black person. That they had beachfront property. It was close to, I believe it was 5 acres beachfront property, which they had started to put houses on for Black people to come and enjoy the beach. What's notable about that is that there was segregation on beaches all around them.
Right.
The city of Manhattan Beach decided that they could not have Blacks who actually legally owned the property, could not have them in that community. And what they did, using powers of the government, they then declared that property to be condemned. They did it. They took it from them. They flat out just took it from them, gave them nominal money for it. I believe the amount they gave them was something like $5,000, which was certainly minuscule compared to what it was worth. The point is they were run off. Right. That property stayed vacant for years. Then when the family decided to do a lawsuit, the city of Manhattan Beach decided suddenly to turn it into parkland to justify the taking of it. Right. They turned it to parkland. And it stayed parked until, once again, that lawsuit came before the state. And the state could not defend it. Recently, the governor of the state declared that that land had to be given back to the Bruce family. Now, the Bruce family, the original owners are dead now. Their children are still alive.
Right.
It's been given back to them, and just recently, I believe, this spring. But that is just, again, the most recent episode.
Right.
You can continue. I mean, you have issues such as where the government policy mandates that freeways, highways go through Black neighborhoods. Black property is taken from people, and once again given to them minuscule value. Once again, that explains this whole thing about disinheriting people. That explains why Blacks have a tenth of the inheritance of white people.
Yeah, this is a great segue to the numbers, and of course these are a few years old. But this is why, as of 2017, white households were twice as likely as Black households to receive an inheritance. And when white people inherit money, it typically is 3 times the amount Black beneficiaries get. Those inheritances help drive the racial wealth gap. Receiving an inheritance boosts the median wealth of white families by $104,000, but for Black families, it's just $4,000. So instead of wealth, millions of Black families have passed down something else from one generation to the next. The mental and emotional stress that results in a constant threat of white violence and financial insecurity. And you can see this, just in terms of, other policies, and you've talked about this, Thomas, that it's not just only inheritance or lack thereof, but there are other obstacles like redlining, bank loan discrimination, not being able to get a foothold in building wealth. And that's part of the legacy that just continues to, just when you think you're getting ahead, you don't.
I want to just also make something clear. Ghettos are not created by the people who live in them. Ghettos are created by official government policy. And you named 3 of them. But there are also, once again, let's take Levittown, which was built and funded by the federal government for veterans coming back from the war. Government policy stated that Levittown could not allow people of color to move there. This is government policy. And as a result, wealth was built because white people and white families that moved into those communities were able to get subsidized property, subsidized housing, which they pay less than $5,000 for. Today, the housing is worth, I would guarantee, is worth at least $250,000 upwards. Okay, that is official government policy, which discriminates against people gaining financial security. Department of Agriculture. Let's talk about that. And I can speak on that with some personal authority in my family. My family comes from the South, owns land. They still own it today. They got that land during Reconstruction, and the book talks about that. They maintained it. However, white farmers next to them, and this is in Alabama, Castleberry, Alabama, white farmers for them were able to get Department of Agriculture loans to buy things like fertilizer, equipment, all that. My family that owned property could not get those loans. It was illegal for them to get loans from the U.S. Department of Agriculture in those southern states, specifically Alabama. So what do you think happened? Black farmers basically lost their land. White farmers picked it up for pennies on a dollar. That's, again, it was public policy, official policy. Fortunately, my family was able to hold on to their land. God knows how. Another way that Blacks, and I don't want to just say Blacks, people of color are kept out of the economy, is segregated housing. And again, that is official government policy. There's nothing haphazard or random about how housing gets where it is. So, you combine that all together, that explains why people of color don't have the financial security that people who are white have.
I want to throw in some other factors that I don't think we talk enough about in this context of economic security, and that is disintegration over the years and the threats to the Black family, whether it's from welfare policies, whether it's from law enforcement, the judicial system that breaks up families because people are thrown in, given ridiculous sentences or arrested. Just even we've seen examples to this day where a simple thing of being arrested and charges, whether you're supposed to be innocent to proven guilty, that even a simple thing as an arrest that threatens the job of the person because they can't make bail, because they end up in a jail for upwards of a year sometimes or more, because they somehow get lost in the system, and all of that, you lose your job. You Even if you go serve a term for a year, try getting a job when you come back out. And even if you are sent to prison for more than a year, there's so many. I remember being part of a group that talked about the check the box movement, which is where when you go to do your application for a job, and they say, "Have you ever been arrested?" or "Have you ever been convicted, excuse me, of a felony?" And you're supposed to check the box. And increasingly, there's been a movement, and I don't know, I can't tell you what the status of the movement is right now, but there were efforts to eliminate that. That if you're going to check that box, you've already you won't even get to the next stage. Even though you may have been out of prison for years and been, quote unquote, rehabilitated, and you maintain a good life, again, what does that do? It prevents you from entering the economic stream of this country and building any kind of wealth that you can then pass on. I mean, why are we even talking about inheritance when the reality is that people, are stopped from even enjoying the economic security in this country because of racist policies?
Yeah, I have a hard time believing that any of this is accidental. That this is not part of a greater plan. Let's take what you just said about the criminal justice system. There are a number of cases where people committed misdemeanors, languish in jail because they don't have the money to get out. They either don't have money for an attorney, they don't have money to make bail. And we have a number of cases where I can cite you where people who had misdemeanors die in jail. And on top of that, we're not even talking about those who have been arrested who are innocent, who go before judges and juries that are basically white, that they then are guilty and we're found out later they're innocent, who spend anywhere up to 50 years in jail. I can point you to a number of those cases.
Right.
And in most instances, when those people get out, there's nothing waiting them. And when I say not, the state makes a mistake, whether it be intentional or unintentional, and those people rarely get any kind of anything monetary for it.
Compensation, rarely. Right.
Yeah, sometimes they do get compensation, but it often is nothing compared to what they lost. Not to mention the families, not to mention what it does to those communities. So, this stuff we're talking about is part of an intentional policy. And the reason why that policy is intentional is because I think you want to have a workforce. And this is where it comes back to. The workforce they want to have they want it to be undervalued. They want that workforce to be basically desperate. And when people come out of prison, what can they do? They can't get a decent job. They're going to be forced down to the lowest rung of the economic ladder. Other thing is, just compare this to this. I would love to see some tracking on what happens when a white former prisoner gets out versus what happens to a Black former prisoner. Do we have the same issues in terms of economics? I bet you don't. Now, again, I'm only speaking from just what my opinion, but I put a lot of money on it, that the outcomes are totally different.
Yeah, and here's the other things. I mean, you can look at before you can have money to pass down, you have to be in a position where you can earn that money.
Mm-hmm.
And so the kinds of things that we were talking about. So if you're discriminated against when you're looking for a job, or when you're in school and you're put on a track
Yes.
to a lower paying career versus a career that's going to take you into college and possibly into a more lucrative career. But then you're still going to be faced with racism when you go look for a job. And even if you're lucky enough to jump all these hurdles and you get this, career. When I was at Long Beach City College, I remember running into a lot of folks, who worked in the trades, whether it was nursing or they were going to be mechanics, or they had some kind of a trade, they still had to get to that point where they could get a job. And the big problem was how far they were going to get to build that job. Where was going to be, particularly in the economy that we have today, where two families have to work their buns off just to survive, the normal everyday, particularly during this pandemic and the post-pandemic. I mean, how do you build wealth if you can't jump over all these hurdles? Even if you can jump over all these hurdles, you still face the prospect of that you just have enough money to survive versus building wealth. And I think that's the real issue is how do you build wealth when there's all these other things that are going on? Whether it's from education, discrimination, racism, in like we said, redlining, bank loans, whether you're arrested and spend a year in prison only to then be found not guilty and you've lost your job. I mean, there's all these things that just, to me, I can see them as being overwhelming. And I don't know what the answer to is because there's so many factors. Is how do you address all these factors? Or can you address all these factors?
Let's do something which I think would be instructive. Let's widen this lens a little bit. And what I mean by that is everything you've said is accurate, and true. But we've been looking at the specific thing of race, how what race plays in inherence in this country. And it does, there's no doubt about it. However, I think we need to widen it, particularly today, with what is happening to the economic reality for people in this country.
Right.
And we're talking about the income gap.
Yes.
It's no longer just an income gap between Black and white, which is, yes, it is there, no question about it. But there's an income gap between those at the top and those who languish near the bottom, of which there are significant numbers of whites. In fact, numerically, there are more whites than there are Blacks. Percentage-wise, there's a higher percentage of Blacks, of course, in that group,
right.
And other people of color. What I've noticed over the years is a problem that starts in those communities of color, migrates its way up to white communities. And one of the classic examples is the war on drugs. Now, the war on drugs started as a political thing. It was a political thing started by Richard Nixon, basically to get at lefties and to get at people of color, particularly Blacks.
Right.
Okay,
right.
And that once again, I want to say that's documented. That's not hearsay. It's documented coming from his own mouth. So they brought in these forces into those communities, which decimated them. But now what's happening today is those drugs that were in those communities, and by and large, those drugs are not brought into those communities by those people who live in those communities, but brought in by outside forces. Now those drugs are spread to white communities, specifically rural communities, specific poor white communities. And now you have an epidemic going on, which now is no longer a crime problem per se. It's a health problem, public health problem. Now, I don't want to make light of anyone's problems or addictions, but what we're seeing now is a failure to take care of a problem when it was one community because you didn't give a damn. Now that problem has basically expanded into a community, to a large community. It affects the entire country, not just that small segment who people say we can brush off. That is going to be true through a lot of things. And economically, what you're seeing now and what you're seeing with, quote unquote, those Trumpites who are out there, those are white men who basically lost their advantage. They certainly see it. The angry white man, who somehow feels that the privilege of being white has narrowed. And because they're seeing women, they're seeing people of color now have a more equal footing. And then comes the charlatan who's promising them that once again, not only is he going to make America great again, he's going to make America white again.
Yeah.
And that is appealing to many of those people. And one reason why it's appealing, one reason why our democracy is under attack, is because we've allowed the problems that have been festering in those communities to say that's a black problem. Well, unfortunately, that black problem, and it's not just drugs, it's so many parts of the economy, such as the income gap, is now migrated to the broader white community. And that's what's going to create some real problems in this country in the future.
Yeah, but it's like this whole question of in this country, you can no longer, or you can never actually look at this economic disparity through only a racial lens. You always have to look at it through both a class and a racial lens. And the problem, however, is that even within those classes, economic classes, there is, there's you and I have talked about this before. In New York City, there are unions that remained white.
Yeah.
The blue collar unions who have remained white for generations and tried their darndest to exclude blue collar people of color because of racism, plain and simple. Although they always use the thing as, well, it's a family thing. We're passing right. And yet you could make the argument they're really basically economically the same class. Okay, blue collar, very general. But within that class, the disparities in income, the disparity in access to better jobs, to even just to union membership was always a problem, and you can find that in a lot of cities. So it's so hard to say we need to look at this as just a class. And probably in many other countries, you could look at this simply as an issue of class. But because of the unique nature of our history here in America, race plays such an important part of the limitations on people of color within a class. And even for people who are lucky enough, to move up in the class structure and become wealthy, for those who are honest, they will always tell you the same thing, that it doesn't matter how much money you have or how green your money is, that in some certain communities, you can still not live because you're a person of color.
Well, there is an old saying that holds true even today. The two places where there's the most racism is Sunday at church and also when you go to a real estate office. Those are the two strongholds of racism today. And what's important about particularly real estate is that I maintain that where you live determines the outcome of your family's fortunes. Starts with schools, of course, but it also is a matter of like in a community which is lower income, you're going to be dealing with issues from police, unfair policing, over policing. That's the reality. If you live in a middle class, diverse community or white community, that over policing is lessened. Your schools are going to be better. You're going to have greater opportunities. Your lifespan, your life expectancy is going to be.
Yes. Yes.
It has so much to do with the address. And again, it has been predominantly a racial thing, but it's getting to be more and more of an economic thing and more of a class thing, which of course, let's realize we don't have class issues here. We don't have class. We don't have an upper class, a lower class. We don't have a working class.
I must be dreaming or suffering a nightmare.
You are.
And there's some other issues that we want to put on the pile here. Things as simple as access to transportation.
Oh,
God. I take for granted I've got a car, but in cities where having a car is probably not worth having a car, speaking specifically of New York. I didn't have a car until I moved to DC. And even there, when I had a car, I used it, sometimes it just didn't make any sense to use the car because I worked in the city. The car was probably parked more than it was driven in some of those years. And yet, before the metro was built, the train system in the 70s was built there. Subway system in the 70s was built there. People depended on buses.
Mm-hmm.
When you have a good public transit system where you can go from your home easily to a job, a lot of things changes for you.
Yes.
Now, here in Southern California, where you are expected to have a car, but not everyone can afford a car, or if you do have a car, you're always pouring more money into the car than it was worth.
Mm-hmm.
How do you get access to transportation to take you to jobs? I don't know if you remember a few years ago, there was the whole thing about the bus riders union and fighting for better access, for more bus schedules, so that poorer people could get to their jobs. And the debate about where was the subway system being built, which was, remember, in those days of DC, the train system was being built to take people from the suburbs into the city, back to the suburbs. Mm-hmm. Now, of course, it's much more vibrant subway system there. But just simple things like you just take for granted. The idea of transportation, the ability to get to a job if you've got one, mm-hmm. and then being able to build some kind of wealth out of that job. And it's difficult. And I go back to the original issue. Can you build wealth today in this economy?
Some people can. Some people do. Okay.
Right.
It's we see that, you see that really with people who work in certain industries and who have the means and the education to take advantage of it. Yes, you can, but all too often, that's becoming a smaller and smaller group. Because one of the things that I was reading in statistics, people who have means are marrying other people who have means.
Yes.
And
Yes.
in previous generations, you could see families would or people would, from one family of means, apt to marry somebody who did not have those same means. But the person with the means brought up the entire family. But today, that's apparently becoming less and less frequent. Therefore, it's really basically keeping a lid on the mobility, the economic mobility of families and people.
Yeah.
And the other thing is it's this long-standing problem. When you have segregated housing, that allows you to basically keep people out of the economic system because the jobs are not in those communities.
Right.
And
Right.
back to your point about transportation. More often than not, there is no transportation from those communities to where the jobs are. Or if there is, it's generally bad, and it generally takes a long time and generally underfunded.
Right.
That's
Right.
the key thing about funding. It goes back to your bus strike. There was a whole thing about why in the metro, the reason why that strike took place is because they were taking money out of the bus systems here in Southern California, specifically LA, and put it into the metro. And those metro lines, by and large, were not running in those communities that needed it. So the money was being
here it is. Yeah. Here it is 2022, and the Crenshaw line, which of course the whole Crenshaw area is being gentrified. You have east to west lines that are going out to Santa Monica. It's getting better, but some of these lines are not going to be completed for possibly even decades. And some of them haven't even broken lines.
Right.
Yeah,
but they moved people out.
Yeah, they move people out.
They moved people out. And unfortunately, the people they moved out are those who had some foothold because they might have had home ownership. Right. And while they're still waiting to do the construction, those people were moved out. They no longer have a home. They've gotten some paltry amount of money, but in Southern California, try and get a new home with the housing rate. So what you're doing again is you're depressing the percentage of people that can own homes because you freaking moved them out on a construction for construction as it started on a freeway.
Let's sort of in wrapping this up. I really want to talk about when I sat down and read this chapter again. I just had to keep coming back to all these various layers, historically as well as today, that keep families from moving up the economic ladder, and how difficult it is becoming increasingly difficult in a culture where the average CEO pay is great multiples of what the average wage earner makes. And yes, people do break through. People, become lawyers and they move up the management chain in corporations and they make money. But that's not the vast majority of regular Americans of color. Short of getting rid of predatory capitalism, what can be done?
Well, Antonio, let me just say this. You talked about predatory.
I'm overstating the simplicity of this question, or the complexity of this question.
I don't know if you're overstating the question. And I just point out to you one example of this whole thing. It just happened just this past week. New York City, there was a particular landlord, or not even a landlord, it was a corporation that bought up in excess of 100 rent-stabilized apartments and or rent-controlled apartments. Okay, bought them up, basically forced people out by basically not doing repairs, cutting off the heat, and then once they got these people out, that housing went at market rates, which in New York City means somebody was probably paying $2,000 a month. And these are typically in communities of color. That apartment, since gentrifying, went from $2,000 a month to $5,000 a month. Here's the problem. So they prosecute this company, these individuals, right? And mind you, that we have hundreds of people that were thrown out of apartments, that lose their apartments, rent control, rent stabilized apartments in a market like New York City. They won't get back those apartments. The city fined the builder, the developer, $15 million. Okay, $15 million. Now they probably have made $15 million many times over with what they've done. There's going to be no criminal prosecution. So, and what's that individual, that corporations from doing it again? Okay. Now, there also is 3 other corporations, this is nationwide, which took the money from the federal government, the pandemic.
Right.
Okay, and those corporations, which are large corporations, bought up buildings which were in communities of color, threw out people, and then did some renovation and basically sold in these gentrified neighborhoods. What's going to happen to those corporations? They'll be fine. It's not likely that any of them will serve any time because it won't be criminal. That is where our system falls apart. White-collar crime is rarely perceived as being criminal crime unless it's huge. Rarely does an executive who makes those kind of decisions serve time. Now, I can go point you to the case of the drug pharmacy companies.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, OxyContin, those companies that put out that drug will not serve. No one involved in that will serve time. Okay. Hence the problem. We prosecute to the fullest extent of the law those who we deem to be, low-level criminals, blue-collar criminals. White-collar criminals get a pass. And I'm overstating it to some degree, but it's a small degree.
Yeah.
That is what's wrong with the economic system, which comes back to our criminal justice system.
And it goes full circle all around because it's, this idea that we live in a society that an economic system that is increasingly favors predatory practices because it's all about getting rich at whoever's expense. And, yes, there are occasional prosecutions, but they usually end up as civil suits. And particularly the larger the corporation, yes, I know for a lot of people, they think themselves, wow, yeah, but they got fined billions of dollars. And, some of that money is going to be paid by insurance companies. Some of it will be paid by reserves that they've built up. But even going down to the lower, companies that smaller companies that own properties, it's again about we've got to make money at people's expense. And this goes to things as silly, you would think, as simple, excuse me, that's not the word, not silly, but as simple as things as, I was just talking to my son who was telling me about the HMO that he goes to, he found out was bought by some corporation. It's a small HMO in Texas. And I had just recently read about companies who are going around because health is an issue, is a growth industry. You know what I'm saying? So back to the idea of predatory capitalism, that you throw all of this in that threatens both the class structure and the racial structure in this country. And you think to yourself, me being the optimist that I am, that there is just no hope.
No.
But
there is hope.
But I'm being facetious here. the hope has to come from these generations, the next generations, who begin to understand, and you see them. You see the climb, the cries for that we need to really do something about. And it's only going to come through political means. We've got to do something that evens the playing field, and in some cases brings people up to the level playing field. So yeah, that's how I want to end this. Last words from you?
Well, on that note, again, I'm going to take the optimistic viewpoint.
I'm optimistic.
I mean,
this is optimistic for me, man.
That's true. This is optimistic for you. We've gone through this in this country before. Where you have these humongous gaps in wealth, and often it doesn't end well for the economy. I mean, the last one, of course, was depression, which my parents lived through, and I suspect your parents did as well. When it gets that out of whack, and this is the problem with capitalism, when it gets that out of whack, because capitalism, I make a distinction between predatory capitalism and capitalism. There are things you can say that are nakedly predatory about capitalism, but as a whole, what capitalism does is just says that go out, and greed is good, and for a while greed works, but if greed's based on an imbalance of rights, if capitalism is based on the fact of exploitation to people that cannot defend themselves, and that's often the case, because capitalism rewards those who go out and take advantage of a situation, take advantage of often people that are the low-hanging fruit.
Well, look at 2008.
Yeah, I mean, and again,
great example of that.
The economic crisis we had then. Who was prosecuted? There's one guy, one Asian guy
at a bank.
One Asian guy at a bank, was prosecuted. I mean, that tells you again
what does that tell you?
So capitalism, and I want to make clear something, because I don't want to sound like I'm this raving capitalist, or for that matter, socialist. I mean, because I grew up in a capitalist system. I supported the capitalist system, for years. But I also understand what's fair and what's not fair. What all I'm saying is, and it's a lot, let's even the balance. Let's not have you stopping on one side of the scale and having it weighed so great for those who already have.
And with those words, I want to thank you very much. We're dealing with Chapter 11, Inheritance of the 1619 Project. And actually, we're coming up on the next one, which is going to be really interesting, Chapter 12, which is about medicine in this country. The healthcare system. So thank you again very much, Tommy Fields.
Thank you, Antonio, for doing this.
Antonio Ruiz, 1619 Project Podcast.